I'm Emma Wilcox, and I make long-term photographic projects concerned with contested narratives and local memory. I work on foot, I work at or near night, and I sometimes work via a helicopter. The landscape that I work in is dense, visually, textually, chemically. The density of markings includes human bodies, geological timekeeping, stories told in bars, and EPA documents. And when I talk to you today about an art practice that's now almost 20 years old, something that I can tell you is forensics formed my way of working and still functions as the base. Photography was my first love, and like any longtime love, it's been complicated. Photo history is full of ghosts and uneven power dynamics. There's this archetype, the stranger, the street photographer who's unconnected from the neighborhood. So there I was initially, photographing someone's home, maybe their former site of work, and someone would come up to me and they would be really angry. And they would say, you don't even know what you're looking at. So the first major shift that occurred in my practice came about when I started focusing not just on land use politics broadly and on issues of environmental justice, but very specifically on the topic of eminent domain, because I was photographing my own life. And I was at once the stranger as well as the person who would be telling others, you don't even know what you're looking at. So I think that artists who make work like mine should contend for themselves with the issue of ruin porn. I remember a friend that I have in Detroit who told me about right before the first wave of foreclosure crisis, she would find art photographers on her lawn. There's a really good discussion of ruin porn on a photo blog called 1/125th, and the writer Nick Scher talks about Roy DeCarava's work, and he talks about how the city that DeCarava records is not a city that is dying. Instead, it is a city in which people stubbornly persist at living and working. So persistence has always been what I've been interested in. What persists? Place names, official or unofficial, memory, stories, graft, structural stability, chemical traces. What persists? And I sometimes think about the diamond alkali workers who were ordered to wade out at low tide at night into the Passaic River and jettison toxic dioxin wastes into that water right here in Newark. And this happened because Diamond Alkali was manufacturing Agent Orange at the height of the Vietnam War. And that ended up being the largest release of this carcinogenic material, dioxin, in US history. And I only know about this story, and so I'm telling it to you, because the workers' experiences were actually verified and reported on a little bit. So what if those workers had never had their stories reported? The stories would be categorizable as hearsay, and they would be really easy to dismiss, and they probably would just live on as local memory, or maybe just within the workers' families. And it's going to be very difficult, it is very difficult to prove long-term causality in terms of health impacts for the workers and for the neighborhood, because that old dioxin is now mixed in with new dioxin that's in the air and the water and the soil from a massive incinerator that the neighborhood fought against and lost. So what I think about with this story is, what is the half-life of a chemical? What is the half-life of a story? What is the half-life of the official version of events? I'm going to confess to you right now that I'm in the midst of another shift in my practice, and I'm in the messy and kind of awful and unresolved part where I have to figure out what I should do, because the landscape of contested sites that I photographed for so long is largely disappearing from sight. The chemical traces are, of course, in our blood, but the landscape of closed factories is largely disappearing. And so the knowledge of how our immediate environment was made, was put together, exists at this point in court reporting and local memory and in corporate genealogy. And there's been a lot of discussion recently in the last few weeks of this year 2020 about corporate genealogy. I think about, where does profit originate from, and how does it move forward in history and time? How does it stay within families? How does it get its name changed and changed again? And what evidence is there in the built environment of that profit's trajectory? This is my problem. It is just too easy to photograph a closed local supermarket, a downtown, maybe a former factory site, and just kind of make a quick reference and say globalization or post-industrialization, or maybe early capitalism or early late capitalism or early middle late capitalism. It's too easy, you see. It's too easy to do, and there becomes this kind of image shorthand. At this point in my life, what I am most interested in is what kind of images can be made when the site that was evidence of a change is gone, but of course the change that was wrought is not. I'm in the midst of this shift, and what hasn't changed is how I work in my studio. My studio, as you can see, isn't really defined by where it happens to be at any given moment. It's sometimes outside, on the street. It can be anywhere, but I define it in terms of how I behave in it. I move very slowly. I work very slowly, even by the standards of other artists who use large format cameras. I spend a lot of time going back to the same place over and over again. I spend a lot of time walking and standing, maybe sitting, and just trying to become as aware as possible of the very slow movements of light and shadow. My studio is not my property, so there's the presence of other living beings, there's the weather, and there's all those variables that come in that create that kind of distance and that tension between what I think I'm doing and the resulting image that actually gets made. I measure my exposures in minutes, if not hours, in terms of how long the camera shutter is open for. And as a result, something comes into play called reciprocity failure. And you can Google reciprocity failure, but for me, it's when the math no longer functions the way that it's said to, the way that we think it's going to. There's an element of improvisation. You have to figure out, because there's so little light, how you're going to get enough of it into the lens to expose an image on the film. And it's unpredictable. So reciprocity failure is basically a near perfect analog for that distance and that tension between how systems are said to function and how they actually do. I just have this endless curiosity about how it is that things have come to be the way that they are. That's the evidence again. So there's two things that I wanted to share with you, if you're still there, that are specifically about the photograph that's in the exhibit Feast and Famine at the Paul Robeson Galleries. That photograph is titled Market. And so the first thing is that with all of my photographs, there's a very intentionally ambiguous time signature. This is something I started doing very instinctively without a lot of thought. And then when I looked into it, I discovered that the cutoff point, the last year of manufacture for anything that's included in my pictures, seems to be roughly around 1979 to kind of maybe 1983. And I find this funny because I was born in 1980. I'm a Reagan baby. I'm a post-NEA 4 kid. What's less funny is right around that time, a lot of policy decisions and shifts and trends nationally, I think, set us up for this present moment that we're in, and that's less funny. The other thing that I thought it would be fun to tell you is about something that you can see at the edge of the photograph. And it's always good to kind of look at the edge of the frame, look at the margins. And so if you look in the corner of the photograph, there seems to be some kind of movement present, some kind of motion blur. And that is with the very old-fashioned paper decorations that you can see in this closed supermarket. It's an illusion, it's not actually there. The illusion of motion comes from how the picture was lit. It's lit very late at night with car headlights from a car that had this damn tendency to overheat very easily. So how I made the picture is I set up my lens right up against the plate glass of the window of the supermarket. You turn on the car, you run it so that the headlights will illuminate the scene. So after a few minutes, the car starts overheating really badly. So you have to turn off the car and let it cool for about an hour. Then you can turn it back on and start exposing the scene with some more light from the headlights. So if the picture does anything for you, if it gives you any kind of feeling at all, it might be because it was made with long intervals of darkness interrupted by this light that fades. And I like to work with words sometimes as well as with images. And a couple years ago, I wrote this thing trying to convey the same kind of feeling. Some ways to get over an incomplete list. Shamanic, self-styled disruptives everywhere. Some even claim to speak for the creatives. Rebrand previously included features as upgrades. Add fees to everything. Charge more for less. But have really big coffee mugs with homilies about indulgence and snazzy fonts for sale. Seriously, the mugs are getting bigger. Have you noticed? Am I seeing things? What is real? Conditions once ascribed to an other and deemed tolerable for them eventually normalized for more and more, but slowly, sort of, so it creeps up on you. The opt-out landscape wherein everyone who possibly can avoid interacting with the features of the so-called commons does, by paying for rapidly proliferating options, as they are called. A town votes to close the library. When was before, the other time, when it was another way? My finger comes to rest on a sentence, Ouija board style, in a book I'm reading by Madhu Dubey about cities. A longer historical view reveals an infinitely regressing quest for a lost golden age. Sometimes at dusk, I think I can hear the phantom hand clapping of girlhood, the chants and songs. we all fall down. And later, we don't need no water. Let the motherfucker burn.